everyone who is here. Welcome, first off. But if you'd like to show your face, we would like to see your face. And I think if you raise your hand, then you become promoted to a panelist and you become visible. And it would be so much nicer, because otherwise it's like we don't know you're there. Okay, so we're going to start now. Yes? Okay. So my name is Jo McDonagh, as you can see, because it's written on the screen. And I'm going to introduce our speaker, Santanu, and then we're going to have a conversation about the archive that he's going to lay out for us and talk about in his presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So that's going to be the format of the session. Before we start, I just want to say thank you to the brilliant organisers of this event. I think it's so impressive and so interesting and so brilliantly organised that they deserve great reward for doing so. Anyway, it's my huge pleasure to introduce Santanu Das, who is Professor of Modern Literature and Culture and Senior Research Fellow at All Souls College, Oxford. Santanu is the author of a monograph that was published in 2006 called Touch and Intimacy in World War I. And he has edited a number of collections, a number of volumes of essays around these topics as well, to do with First World War literature and the senses and so on and so forth. His first book has been very influential. It's an important book. It's an important book in modernist studies, in World War I studies, but it's particularly important, I think, within the kind of new discipline, I suppose, of the history of the senses. What Santanu does in this book is talk about embodied experience by thinking about the sense of touch in particular, and relating this to poetry and thinking about a kind of poetics that is organised around bodies and bodies touching each other. So it's a very compelling method that he develops there. The latest book that came out last year or 2 years ago, maybe 2018, which has a beautiful cover, is called India, Empire and First World War Culture. And this kind of develops the themes that he starts off thinking about in the 2006 book, but develops them in really extraordinary ways. It's a very, very impressive book. For those of you who haven't read it yet, be prepared to be astonished actually by its ambition, achieved ambition, I should say, and it's the range of questions that it deals with, the range of sources that it takes on, the range of research, the number of different kinds of archives that he's been to, the number of different countries he's been to in researching this book. It's multilingual, multimedia, multidisciplinary. It's really, it's a really impressive and staggering achievement in so many different ways, and very compelling as well. So there's no one better really to talk about the colonial archive, I think, than Santanu, which is what he's going to do today. But I wanted to just finish off just my introduction by adding a personal note, because we've been talking a lot in this conference about nostalgia. And so thinking about Santanu's book has made me very nostalgic as well, because Santanu and I were colleagues a little while ago, and it's made me nostalgic really for that time, which was a very fascinating time, I think, a very rich moment at King's, where we were both in the English department, where there were a lot of scholars doing quite interesting work in post-colonial studies, anti-colonial studies, lots of kind of work in global literature, I suppose. But one of the things that Santanu did alongside researching this amazing book and doing all the other things that one has to do as a professor was that he was the organizer and coordinator of a huge network of scholars across Europe who were all working on colonial experience of First World War. And he organized this extremely interesting and intricate network of events that happened across Europe. Whenever you bumped into Santanu, he was always popping off to Belgium or somewhere like that. And some of these events had a kind of outreach element to them. And one of my particularly strong and warm memories of that time was the concert that you organised in the chapel at King's, where you hired a tenor to come and sing First World War songs to us in this very, very, very kind of intimate and lovely concert. So I'm just going to leave you with that idea of Santanu, the impresario, as well as the scholar, and now he's going to talk about his archive for this book. Thanks, Santanu.
Thank you so much, Jo, for that very generous introduction, that extravagantly generous introduction. I guess I'm now set for a big fall. Also, thank you so much for inviting me. Kind of many thanks to all the organizers. And I've been kind of primarily in touch with kind of Upasana, Doctor. So big thank you to her. Also, I've been kind of attending some of the sessions, and it has been a truly kind of extraordinary kind of conference. So kind of a real pleasure. Now I've just noticed that my slide has somewhat frozen. Can you see you can't see my PowerPoint, can you?
No.
Okay, I will share again, share screen, okay. Now I can't move, one moment, I can't go back or forward. Okay, sorry. You have now seen the entire slide, but can't, sorry. Yes. Well, as Jo said, I'm a literary and cultural historian of the First World War. And when I was invited to this conference last year, I actually had meant to assemble a completely new archive. But kind of, being in lockdown, kind of this is our third lockdown in the UK, and kind of leading this kind of largely kind of phantasmal kind of life, and with all the archives closed, I thought I'd work with the materials I already have and see what a war archive looks like when we think of it in terms of an archive of imperial decline. In any case, the First World War kind of brought down three empires, kind of Russian, German, the Ottoman, and it also marks kind of the turning point kind of in the kind of fortunes of the British Empire, though post Versailles kind of Britain kind of has kind of more kind of territorial gains. So I shall be coming to this subject at an angle, and I'll kind of address about this entanglement of Europe, the British Empire, and South Asia, not just kind of in terms of ideas, but actually the slow, uneven, and often imperceptible experiences of decline, and the deposit such experiences leave in the archives, not as events or a spasm, but rather as structures of feeling. And I shall start with three examples. The first one, this is kind of a little snippet from kind of a colonial newspaper published on the 30th of July, 1914, a whole 1 week before Britain had even entered the war. War will not be confined to Austria and Serbia, but will be a universal war in which all the great empires of Europe will be involved. For having partitioned Asia and Africa, they have no hunting grounds left and will now descend into the arena and hunt each other. The materials of war, which have so far been used to destroy Orientals, will now be employed in the destruction of Europeans. I'll move on to my second example. This is from a personal letter from Rabindranath Tagore to his friend C.F. Andrews. I should briefly mention that Tagore was kind of highly kind of anti-colonial, but he was also staunchly anti-nationalist. And it's an unusual combination. We have the kind of same thing, for example, in Virginia Woolf. Here Tagore is writing, in India, when the upper classes ruled over the lower, they forged their own chains. Europe is closely following Brahmin India when she looks upon Asia and Africa as a legitimate fields for exploitation. She seems to have exhausted the oil that once lighted her lamp. Now she's feeling a distrust against the oil itself, as it were not necessary for the light. My third example, it's from a folk song. It's sung by kind of women of Punjab, kind of during the First World War, when their men had left for war. Married men win battles, tell me, oh Firangi, which is quite a derogatory word for a foreigner or a stranger. Where is this written? Take the bachelors to war. Oh Firangi, then victory will be yours. In other words, don't take my husband. And on the top right, kind of you see a kind of painting done kind of during the Second World War by this artist who's drawing on his memories of the First World War. You know, there is no sense of that adventure. It's just kind of this sense of kind of going to one's kind of doom and death as soldiers leave Punjab yet once more during the Second World War. And on the right, this curious object, it's a German helmet found with a Naga battalion where they had fitted two horns and some kind of hair. It's at the kind of Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. We can come back to it maybe during the conversation. What we have here is a range of responses to an empire in crisis from kind of a variety of standpoints and emotions, from anti-colonial schadenfreude of the journalist in the first quote, to Tagore's intricate complication of the debate, to the angry labeling of the imperial master as a Firangi. Interestingly, kind of stranger is also the word that Gibbon uses in Decline and Fall to characterize empire itself, arbitrary dominion of strangers. Empire in each case is conflated with Europe, as the First World War seems to bring the curtain finally down on both. If declinism, as Jed Esty notes, is, I quote, imagined as kind of nostalgia of past national greatness, how is it felt, absorbed, navigated, or even imagined by the people of the global South in ways that predate and go beyond the neat imaginary of the anti-colonial nation state? P.S. Brandon's book, The Decline and Fall of the British Empire, as its time frame, the years 1781 to 1997, a very long twilight, in which I would say the First World War is definitely a hinge point. If for Ford Madox Ford, the war was a crack in the table of history, the horrors of the Western people across the colonized world, from Tagore in India to Liang Qichao in China to Said Zaghloul in Egypt, wonder, I quote, whether the torch of European civilization was not meant for showing light, but to set fire. Conflagration as a result of moral decline. Tagore writes, the European war of nations is the war of retribution. In this frightful war, the West has stood face to face with her creation, to which she had offered her soul. And kind of just around half an hour back, I was actually kind of speaking at a panel in Foster, kind of on Foster, and we were kind of talking about the Marabar caves. And I remember kind of reading kind of Maud Ellman saying that how the obom of the caves, and it's the only way in which kind of liberalism can speak in kind of a post-war era. For in Britain, such ideas reach a breaking point during the war, for the so-called flower of British youth lay shell-shocked or dead in the fields of Flanders and France, in Isaac Rosenberg's words, burnt black by strange decay. In his essay on the study of literature, 1761, Gibbon writes, "The history of empires is the history of human misery, for military conquest lies at its heart. Throughout the 19th century, the British Empire had smelt of gunpowder, but the violence was largely kept out of Europe. Indian sepoys, the backbone of the Raj, were employed to douse colonial fires across this long 19th century from Egypt and Somaliland to South Africa and China. But what was new about 1914 was that for the first time, hundreds of thousands of these soldiers of color, 4 million men from Asia, Africa, the US, and the Pacific, would be sent into the heart of whiteness, Europe, and beyond, Mesopotamia, East Africa, Persia. What we have as a result is not just an exponential rise in the documentation, as every mood, move, and musing would be recorded, but for the first time in world history, these common colonial subjects would directly enter the archives, and they were the majority of the world's people. Non-literate, but often highly literary. And for the first time in the archives, we have traces of their letters, their voice recordings, their photographs, and paintings. If the colonial archive was meant, according to Anne Laura Stoller, to be, I quote, the supreme technology of the imperial state, what it instead reveals, as Lisa Lowe has recently noted in The Intimacies of Four Continents, 2015, is its equivocation, ignorance, and incoherence. But we also need to step back and ask certain fundamental questions. What is an archive? Is it a noun or a verb, a system or an attempt, a wheel to imperial knowledge or a testimony to colonial mess? Is it given to or created by the scholar? Is it like the train, that other invention of Victorian England with its different compartments? Or is it more like an overburdened bullock cart whose wheels are always in the danger of going in different directions? In a context where imperial fantasies and anxieties cannot be contained within box files and subaltern voices are largely absent, we need to go beyond, I think, these official documents to cultural artifacts, objects, photographs, paintings, songs, and rumors, as well as literary texts, and thus reconceptualize what the archive means. I think often rumors and gossip can tell us more than official documents. Equally, we need to know what questions to bring to this new archive. Sigmund Freud visualized Rome with its layer upon archaeological layer as a model for the human mind. Similarly, the archives may be global information networks, but they're also palimpsests of experience where, if we are attentive enough, we may be able to detect Barth-like, the body in the voice as it sings, the hand as it writes, the limb as it performs. Let us now enter this archive. In the official documents, we hear how many units went to whichever countries they did during these 4 years. Indeed, if the British Empire had been on a downhill slope, kind of since the Sepoy uprising in 1851, the First World War actually seemed to buck the trend. Across the empire, there was wide enthusiasm, even jubilation, at the opportunity of going to the killing fields of France and Flanders. Images of colonial troops arriving at Marseille. This is the first day the Indians arrived on 26 September 1914, were splashed across newspapers. And the first official and the colonial sepoys were subjected to a variety of visual documentation. And the first British film was The Indian Troops at the Front, 1916. Here we have imperial spectacle, not even as ornamentalism, but almost as kitsch. If war and cinema have a twained birth, here we have certain very specific cultural practices being funneled to the technological modernity for imperial propaganda. Yet what cannot be ignored, as you see, are certain elements of pride, performativity, and pleasure. And I love this moment when the hair flies loose. It's like what Benjamin calls the spark of contingency that we get to detect in these films. Indeed, the gestures of the men often break through and exceed the imperial frame, and subaltern agency, I'd claim, start leaking onto the page and on the screen. For historicized reading, one may note here the traces of the hugely influential 8-volume The People of India, compiled by John Watson and John Cale. And here kind of you have a page on the kind of left from this kind of Herculean kind of task, trying to kind of classify almost the impossible, all the peoples of India. But the clip that I showed you is also part of a larger visual archive where the Indian sepoys lurch between eroticized subjects, as you see here. And there is also, I think, a kind of a play between Orientalism and self-Orientalism going on here, as well as also in the wrestling match. Or as colonial brutes kind of wrestling on mules, as we see there, or as modern kind of fully equipped kind of soldiers of an industrial warfare. It is as if the archives cannot make up their minds whether the sepoys belong to Eros or the world of art or that of ethnology or war. Epistemological uncertainty parades as visual excess. And we see that here because even school children, and this is kind of 3 kind of essays that were written by kind of school kids between 9 and 10 years old, kind of who were asked to kind of respond to these kind of images, and all of them, and they are as confused as the archives themselves. Now, in the kind of cartoons kind of that time, and also in the illustrations in kind of various kind of journals and newspapers, and here we have the war illustrated. The Gurkha kind of, I'm just kind of reading out kind of the part of the caption, the Gurkha, knife in hand or in teeth, can glide to the grass. So there is a definite kind of subhuman kind of description of the soldiers, which is quite different, I would say, than what we have seen in ethnological documents in the 19th century. In Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, 1915, Freud writes, I quote, "War strips us of the later accretions of civilization and lays bare the primal man in each of us. We ourselves are, like the primeval man, a gang of murderers." Is this paranoid acknowledgement of moral decline being projected onto the racial other, fused and confused with almost a wishful fantasy of heroic combat that is completely denied in industrial warfare, where actually bodies lay rotting in heaps? What I'm trying to get at is less the aesthetics of decline itself, but rather cultural production of anxieties and fantasies in times of that decline. Yet these images accrete another layer of meaning if we read them across a very different kind of archive. And these are kind of war posters that I came across. And in Urdu, it says, "Who wants to join the war? Those who want to wear the uniform and want to get the money. And here we have these two hands with the coins. And then we have this recruitment song. Get enlisted, the recruits who stand out there. Here you get old shoes, they'll get full boots. There is, this is, both of them are products of kind of propaganda. And yet there is absolutely no mention of any imperial pride or imperial loyalty. Even propagandist products know very well that it is a strictly contractual, almost mercenary engagement at this point in the empire's history. And we have yet another layer, and these are kind of from kind of different kind of publications. Kind of the poster is in the Imperial War Museum, in fact, and this is from kind of private archive. We have yet another layer, and here I'm moving to a very substantial kind of source for our knowledge about this period, about kind of the sepoy voices and agency. And these are the censored letters of the Indian troops. And so that soldiers were often non-literate, they would dictate the letters, and then the letters would be translated and then extracted by the colonial censors. And it's the censored extracts that we have today. And they're almost like palimpsests, I think, and underneath which we can still perhaps hear the echoes of the sepoy heart. But this letter, it's quite striking. It's about kind of self-mutilation, because once the soldiers arrived in the trenches, kind of we have this huge spike in cases of hand wounds, where often the kind of on the right hand, there would be some injury. So I'll just read out this one. I went and saw Khalka Prasad today and asked him about the matter. He said that the smoke of the bhalwa plant is used for this purpose, that is self-malingering. The plant is ground down and then thrown on the burning coals. That part of the body which the smoke touches by the grace of God becomes inflamed. Its effect lasts 3 days. There is another method to pretend to suffer from sciatica. If you want to make your eyes sore, you grind the seed of the rand plant and apply it to the eyes, and one does shurma. First, make a cut in your foot with a knife and then put a piece of copper in the wound. What we have here is a different kind of archive of intergenerational local knowledge working to subvert the workings of the imperial army, but without any sort of nationalist order. We often conflate kind of anti-colonial imaginary with a straightforward nationalism. But what all these documents testify to is the loosening grip of the empire on one hand, and a range of imaginaries that cannot be slotted to a particular nationalist aim. And it is against this fragile hold of the empire upon the colonial bodies that we also need to understand the images of exaggerated colonial masculinity that we saw earlier. Now we'll just give you kind of, so I was talking kind of largely about kind of the kind of aesthetics of kind of propaganda during a moment of crisis and reading them kind of alongside documents. And now I'll just give you kind of 3 little vignettes from kind of the subaltern perspective. The first one actually is a voice recording. And it is kind of, it is by Mal Singh, as you can see. He was recorded on 11th December 1916. And I'll give you a background after we listen to the voice. It's kind of very moving, I think.
एक आदमी थी शेर मांस मक्खन खाता सी हिंदुस्तान में 2 शेर दूध पीता सी एक आदमी उस किसी आदमी ने उसने अंग्रेजा की नौकरी की वो आदमी जुर्म की लड़ाई.
Now, Mal Singh was a prisoner of war in the Wunstorf kind of camp just south of Berlin, where they even built a mosque so as to entice the Muslim sepoys kind of to desert and defect onto the German side. And the recording was made because there kind of was a whole team of academics in Germany at that time, kind of comprising philologists, ethnologists, kind of linguists, and supervised by the Royal Prussian Phonographic Commission, who'd often record these kind of colonial men. And we have 3,000 recordings of colonial soldiers in this archive, of which around 300 are about kind of Indian troops. Now, what is interesting here is that in Mal Singh's kind of testimony, it is actually meant as a colonial experiment, but he transforms it into one of the most haunting examples of life writing or kind of life speaking. Home is remembered as taste on the tongue, as the empire is relegated to nokri, just a job one has to do. There is neither affirmation nor dissent, but a sort of indifference and intense homesickness. Now I'll move on to the second kind of vignette, and I'd love to have kind of your comments or kind of engagement with this kind of three vignettes, because I'm coming from it from a very particular perspective, whereas I'm sure that you have kind of other kind of intensities of meaning that you will notice. So this is kind of a voice recording kind of taking place. Sorry, my second vignette, it's from a remarkable book. It's by a stretcher bearer, Bengali stretcher bearer, Shishi Prasad Sarbadikari, who was taken a prisoner of war in Mesopotamia by the kind of Ottomans, and he had Turkish, and he was employed in a series of hospitals in Baghdad, where he forms this almost kind of cosmopolitan kind of community of the kind of various of the detritus kind of war kind of with kind of Armenians, and he's one of the few Indians who actually witnesses and writes about the Armenian genocide at that time. And there are kind of Turks, kind of Russians, kind of rooms in this kind of hospital. And it's an extraordinary kind of memoir kind of written in Bengali. And in fact, kind of Upasana Datta, she kind of very kindly translated that for me. So here he's looking after Turkish soldiers. None of the Turkish soldiers were literate, but most of them had great fellow feeling. They used to say, "You're not at war with us now, so we are all Kardesh, brothers." We spoke of our lands, our joys and sorrows. One thing that they always used to say was, this war that we are fighting, what is our stake in it? Why are we slashing each other's throats? What we again have here is a sort of cosmopolitanism from below, partly born out of a feeling that the empire could no longer protect these men. And I'll move on to the third one. And here I'll move to fiction. This is a novel by Murkraj Anand, Across the Black Waters, written in 1940, but drawing on kind of the experiences of his father's friends who had served in the First World War. And I've chosen a moment which is quite difficult. It's a racist moment where the Indian sepoys for the first time see kind of African troops, and they use a pejorative kind of term, Habshis. So it's someone in an undertone. They're the sepoys, like us, of the Francisi army, said the Havildar Lakshman Singh. Watch your step, boys, watch your step. But they've got curly hair and a jet black and not brown as we are. Young Karku protested, his belief in the superior brown skin of his inheritance, shocked by the comparison. Lalu felt guilty at having averted his eyes from them. At Marseille, he had seen a few African soldiers talking openly to girls in the cafes, and the French sahibs did not mind. And if the French liked the blacks, why shouldn't he like them? Why had he thought himself superior? He felt ashamed. And again, it's a difficult moment, but I think it's a difficulty we absolutely need to acknowledge the racism that we often have and the hierarchy of kind of brown over black during this time, very much kind of often internalized by these Indian sepoys. But we don't have many traces of that in the archives. We have that often in certain kind of examples of rumors that I've come across kind of in kind of newspapers that, oh, how terrible the Indians are being kind of made to kind of fight alongside kind of Africans. And this is where I think kind of fiction helps us to fill in the gaps in the archives, but also kind of complicate it and complicate kind of a historical kind of archive. I won't say any kind of more in this kind of on this kind of 3 vignettes, but move on to the final part of my talk. But I'd love to have kind of your kind of comments on this kind of 3 kind of bits. Now, interestingly, the first writer who tried to delve into the inner world of the sepoy was none other than Rudyard Kipling. So it isn't kind of Anand or Tagore, but Kipling. His war text, The Eyes of Asia, written as part of imperial propaganda, takes the form of 4 short stories, in each of which Kipling imagines himself to be a semi-literate Indian soldier writing back home the wonders of empire. And I mentioned this text partly to slightly kind of trouble the usual kind of responses we have to Kipling, because I think even his most propagandist texts often has this kind of slightly recessional quality. Now, at first reading, this book comes across as terribly jingoistic, offensive, and predictable, particularly almost a parody of Occidentalism from below. But if we read Kipling's text alongside some of the letters, and so I was working on the letters, and then I came across Kipling's text, and I suddenly realized Kipling not only had access to these letters, but incorporated them. So it's almost kind of this thin line between propaganda and plagiarism, because obviously he's doing it without any knowledge of the Indian sepoys. But what he decides to focus on, it's not the exploit, the heroic exploit of the sepoy or any act of militarism, but on moments of interracial intimacy. So of her own free will, she washed my clothes, arranged my bed. And this is kind of the relationship Indian sepoys often develop with whom they often refer to as our French mothers. Every morning she used to prepare and give me a tray with bread, butter, milk, and coffee. When we had to leave that village, the old lady wept on my shoulder. Now, this whole trope of this French mother is a recurrent theme in the Indian letters, but it also seemed to have almost obsessed Kipling in this text. And I quote, "Mother, think of me always as though I were sitting by you, just as I imagine you would always be beside me. Mother, I shall come in the dead of the night and knock at your door." Now, this extended dialogue with the mother, so vividly imagined, I think gains spatial resonance in the context of Kipling's own life. As is well known, Kipling spent 8 idyllic years in Bombay, very apparently spoke, wrote, and even dreamt in Hindustani. Yet, like many children of the colonial Raj, he was separated from his mother and sent off to England, an experience that haunted him throughout his life. In his old age, does this imaginative identification with the Indian sepoy make Kipling revisit his childhood and create a fantasy of maternal warmth still located in India? So on one hand, we have this closeness to India and this kind of distance almost from the empire. But there is also another subcurrent. More recently, in September 1915, his 18-year-old son, John Kipling, had disappeared in the Battle of Luz, and his body was never found. The imagined Indian soldier writes, "Mother, once I was reported missing, killed, or believed taken prisoner," exactly the message Kipling and his wife had received. And I'd say that in these contexts, the eyes of Asia becomes revealing of various impulses. On one hand, the slow decline of empire, whereas there is no military triumphalism left, but all he's interested in or could be are these moments of interracial contact with very strict hierarchies and power structures and racism, obviously. But with that also blends this sorrow of this father and the desolation of the child who had to kind of leave his mother. And they all flow into each other in the twilight of the empire. Now I'll just kind of wrap up by saying a few things. Sorry, I'm just kind of lost my page. About how the war is being kind of remembered kind of in recent years. Sorry, I just completely seem to have lost our page. Okay. In recent years, the war has been invented almost kind of at this grand stage, kind of this kind of multicultural kind of cohesiveness, particularly in Britain. And while it has resulted in this kind of very important expansion kind of the colonial kind of aspects of the war kind of in modern memory. And I think the color of memory has substantially kind of changed. The problem is that the Indian sepoys are being remembered as they were exactly between 1914 and 1918 as kind of these kind of colonial heroes, as if kind of heroic ardor is the only ticket to success. The problem is that I think that many of the ethnic communities are co-opted into this scheme. And as a result, there is almost like an ideological kind of smoke screen of what actually is happening, because in the name of multiculturalism, what we are having is basically a resurgence of a militaristic culture, basically a variation of kind of what kind of Michael Gove kind of wrote in 2014. And we are kind of moving away, kind of unfortunately, from kind of the 1970s and kind of the very anti-war kind of rhetoric that we had kind of inherited from the war poets. What I'm basically trying to say that the diversity that we are seeing in contemporary memory of the First World War is by no means an exercise in decolonization. And here I've given you kind of three snippets. The first is a report about kind of the Tory minister who was kind of at that time on the cabinet, Saida Warsi, the first kind of Muslim cabinet minister. And she writes kind of Tommies and Tariqs fought side by side, which isn't actually true. And as a result, under this kind of guise of kind of multiculturalism, we are going back to this kind of right-wing kind of militaristic ethos. And here kind of we have kind of you have some other kind of photographs, and it's happening with variations across different countries and continents. For example, on the bottom left, you have the Sikhs kind of in kind of saffron garb, kind of visiting kind of the Menin Gate in a show of kind of nationalism. On the right, we have this extraordinary kind of poppy hijab, where it almost becomes a litmus test of the loyalty of the Muslim. So I think that while often there is a lot of kind of simple piety about this challenge to the color of memory, what is more important is to remember not that they are being remembered, but how they are being remembered. And finally, I'll just leave you with a question. Is it possible to commemorate kind of fallen kind of or kind of dead soldiers without endorsing what they fought for or died for? That is it possible to commemorate the individual without the war? I think I'll kind of stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Shantanu. Okay, so that was wonderful. And in a way, just to answer quickly your question at the end, in a sense, I think that your book does commemorate the Indian participation in the war without aggrandizing military endeavors. But others might want to come in on that. I wanted to begin our conversation, which I think should be a fairly short conversation so that other people can speak, by raising the first question I wanted to ask you was a question about decline, actually. So circling back to the beginning of your talk and thinking about the kind of the rubric of decline, I suppose. And one of the things that I know that when we chatted about this conversation beforehand, that you were thinking, how do I make my, how can I speak to this topic? And one of the things that struck me when I was thinking about your book was the way in which the war functions as a fissure, as you say that at the beginning of the talk today, that a kind of a break, I suppose, and a break between, on the one hand, a history of colonialism and the before and preceding the beginning of the nation state. And it seems to be sort of that experience of the break that is almost a sense of suspended time rather than continuous time. And I just wondered whether there was something that you might want to talk about in thinking about the temporality, I suppose, of the war and the temporality of war in relation to the subaltern experience or the colonial experience. Thinking about, I suppose, questions around periodization that are brought up by the rubric of decline, I suppose.
No, absolutely, Joe. Thank you. That's a wonderful question, because I think we don't anymore talk about the Great War, but rather the Greater War, because there are so many wars happening around that time. And the problem is that where do we start the kind of the First World War, and when do we end? Because you have the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, you have Jallianwala Bagh, you have the Easter Uprising, you have the Bolshevik Revolution. And so what we often see, and this is what that is not that common in the French poetry, often what we see in, for example, some of the Indian elite literature of the war is that these different wars are being telescoped into an imagination of revolutionary order, but without having the nation state as the end point. Mm-hmm. So as you are saying, that it's a very fluid moment where we have a range of anti-colonial imaginaries, but without the teleological end of the nation state. Mm-hmm. And that what makes it, I think, so interesting and fluid. And that has completely changed by the time of the Second World War, because we know that we are going for a nation state.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I was interested that you brought up the term, the Raymond Williams term, the structure of feeling, actually, because I thought that the way in which you're taking your archival, I mean, in a way that the archives that you plunder for your work are sort of literalizations, I suppose, of the theoretical model of the structure of feeling. I don't know if you
absolutely, because in their knottiness, and also the thing that they're not yet kind of present, you have to kind of tease them out. So, and often we do not know how much the characters had known themselves. It's like, what kind of Lawrence says, kind of never trust the author, trust the tale. Yeah. And in the archives, we have this kind of, and I think we often notice new or different structures of feeling if we are reading different archives across each other. So something that I'm kind of saying in, for example, in the British Library, and then I go to Germany or I go to India, and when I put them together, a different structure of feeling kind of gets kind of generated, I think. Yeah. So it's a process of reading, I think, and this palimpsestic quality.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that I was wondering about as well, because it's very striking the way in which you, I mean, the point that you make at the beginning of the book about how one of the significances of the First World War for India is that it is at the first time that so many people have a kind of archival trace, that they're drawn into the archive in a particular way. And I suppose that the idea that there's an archiving of a mass experience of war is something that is really striking. And the way you talk about what you find in the archive, the colonial archive, both the colonial archive and also unofficial archives as well, I suppose, is very, it's just an incredibly rich set of sources that you're drawing on. I suppose for lots of us, we think, my goodness, how did you find all the material? Did you know what you're looking for? This is, I suppose, this very practical question about how you located your archives. Did you know what you were looking for? Did you know what methodology, how did your methodology kind of build, I suppose, and develop as you found the spectacles that you begin the book with, for instance, the spectacles with blood on them, and the songs, the sound archive? It's such a wonderful archive.
Yeah,
and I suppose the thing that I suppose is really striking is the way you get these different archival sources speaking to each other. So it's not just one archive, that it's the kind of conversation that you find and that you're able to sort of choreograph, I suppose, between these different archives. It's so interesting.
Yes, because as you said, I think that's part of the pleasure of the archives, that you don't know what you are going to get. And if I can just give one example, I'll just try to share my screen once more. So I'll just try to find just one. It is frozen. Sorry, I think I'll just, well, okay. I was in the National Archives in India, and I was going through the military records, and suddenly I came across a sealed envelope, and it said it had been confiscated by someone called Mir Mast, and he knew the name because he was one of the few people that had defected onto the German side. And then he goes on this extraordinary jihadist mission. He joins the Germans, and the Germans send him first to Istanbul, and from there to Afghanistan. It's really sad that I can't show this. And then, yes, I found it. And then this is the man actually Mir Mast is talking about. And then I was given the permission to open the envelope, which hadn't been opened since, I guess, 1916. And I was thinking it would have was like nationalism, jihadi, Hindustan, India. Instead, I found this. I hope you can see it on the right-hand side. And it's the biggest reality check I had for, I guess, post-colonial scholars and things. Like, you realize these are young men, and this is what they're thinking about. And I also find it very moving. It's this this appetite for both, this hunger both for life and for food and for bodies to come together. But also, I think there is a sort of daring there, because, the English language, it's a site of power and knowledge. And the Indian sepoy, they're not supposed to know these words. There is a transgression. And again, it's not decline. That's why I said I'm coming at an angle. But somehow the Indians are doing things they're not supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop sharing. I hope you saw, I managed to see the words. Okay, great.
It's wonderful. It's a wonderful source. I'll just ask, I'll finish off my questions and then we'll open it to other people. I'll just ask a last question about the literary. This is one of the things, I suppose, what comes over very strongly as well from your work is the emphasis that you place on ambivalence, the fact that people can have these kind of very ambivalent feelings and contradictory feelings about the country and about the war and about going away and about heroism and all those sorts of things. And it's such a complicated and contradictory field of feeling. And in some ways, it seemed that's what your archive reveals for you is a very a kind of knotted picture of people feeling lots of different things at the same time. And I wondered whether that has some sort of connection to the literary, because you use literary texts in really interesting ways. I think that the Kipling example that you had there, I think is a very telling one. It's Kipling, a writer who many people can't read, and you're kind of showing something that is very kind of complex and subtle and difficult, that he's grappling with there. And I just wondered whether you could say something about the place of the literary in your work, because in some ways the idea that, you know, literature embodies ambivalence is quite a kind of traditional idea about literature in a way. But then on the other hand, you talk about some of your people as being illiterate or non-literate, but literary. And so I was just wondering what literary means in that context.
As a reply to your kind of final question, yes, because they are non-literate, but they have grown up on this rich oral cultures. And I guess that's one of my kind of problems with the term life writing, because you are in a way, you know, keeping out the majority of the world's people. I think if you do just life writing, because, you know, in early 20th century, most of the people would have been non-literate, but they're deeply literary, growing up, as I said, on, you know, stories, poems. But the literary in this work, I think it operate at two levels. Firstly, literary sources, because not just to fill in the gaps of history, but I think it's a sensuous medium. It's a sensuous kind of representation which enables us to enter various words, not just as sources of knowledge, but as almost kind of reimagining. And the second thing, literary as a mode of reading, so that, you know, when archival material, they are not just embellishment or pictures, they are more like visual manuscripts for me. You turn them round and round and put them in kind of conversations. And that's why I increasingly feel that maybe exhibitions or novels are better ways of commemorating, because different sources can argue amongst themselves, because the past is very messy. And I think a literary tool allows us to delve into the word mess. Like I think kind of a reviewer said, apparently that's the most kind of repeated word in my book, mess. And I love, because it is very messy. Human beings are, you know, very messy creatures. And I don't like this, you know, pigeonholing of everything as kind of anti-colonial kind of nationalism. It's much more complex. And we see traces of racism in Mulk Rajanand and traces of a more complex structure of feeling in Kipling.
Thank you. So let's open up now into other people's comments or questions. I think if you put your do the hand raising thingy, that then we know that you want to speak. Oh, Maud.
Unmute. Yeah. Thank you. Santanu, lovely to see you, and that was a great talk. And Joe's right that you've been fantastically resourceful. I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts about World War II and India, and whether, you know, your research had taken you in that direction at all. It seems like, you know, I don't know if you know Yasmin Khan's book. It seems as if the Indians were much more reluctant soldiers in World War II, and this was kind of the kind of last gasp of empire before the whole thing collapsed. And you know, if you were speaking about ambivalence, I was just wondering whether if the nature of that ambivalence kind of changed in World War II. I mean, I think it's kind of weird that in especially in the context of Brexit, when there's all this talk standing up and feeding the Nazis on their own, when they had an army of 2 million Indians fighting the war for them. Anyway, I just wondered if if you did take the research any later into the Second World War.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Maud. The kind of, that's like a kind of a logical route, and it becomes much more ambivalent, but almost much more consciously ambivalent. Because when they're talking about freedom, is it freedom for the empire or freedom from the empire?
Mhm.
And as a result, we have, Subhash Chandra Bose's kind of RNA kind of army, as well as the imperial army. So yes, meaning ambivalence is, I guess, here, I think we still have to dig and look for ambivalence, whereas that's almost like the starting point. It's almost in some ways like the Easter uprising. The whole country gets completely kind of divided. And in families, people almost stop kind of speaking to each other, like whether on which side you are. So it's very much there. I haven't come across, kind of strangely enough, much literature. I thought there would be a lot of writing, but maybe I haven't done the kind of the research enough. And of course, you also have the Bengal famine there. So again, you have various things happening there. You have kind of, so the Bengal famine and these two huge armies. So that creates its kind of own complexities that we don't have in the First World War.
Yeah, thank you.
I think Zara Kazmi was next. Are you there? Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much, Professor Das, for your presentation. It was really illuminating. But I thought at this point that there was so much stuff that we still don't know about Indian narratives of the First World War, even though it's kind of becoming more popular scholarship now. But my question was kind of also about. I was just because I've been attending a lot of the talks in the panels that have happened earlier as well, and specifically, I was thinking of Anvesha's presentation on E.R. Braithwaite and To Serve with Love, and she kind of pointed out the problematic tropes in how Braithwaite presents himself as this kind of Victorian person, but he's still at the end of the day Guyanese. And there was also another talk about post like the reframing of POC identities or people of color identities in Great British Bake Off. And I was just thinking, and also about and you raised that great point about the memorialization of the lives that are lost of these soldiers in contemporary British politics. And I completely agree with your point about how this memorialization is again a reframing of a certain kind of militaristic nationalism. But I was wondering if there is a possibility for non-white or people of color to belong in contemporary Britain without knowingly or unknowingly, willingly or unwillingly aligning themselves to some part of the larger kind of colonial project in some way or the other. And I know it's an open-ended question, but I wanted your thoughts on that.
No, thank you. That's a very kind of thoughtful and thought-provoking question. I'll give you an example when I found it really difficult. After the Grenfell Tower tragedy, David Lammy, the Labour MP, he immediately invoked kind of the First World War and Second World War service, going for the militarist kind of line that, look, kind of West Indians have fought for you and all that, so we should have a right. So as a result, I thought, should I care for, in that sense, historical and kind of literary kind of intricacies, or whether, say that kind of go for this kind of whole militaristic line? And the other, maybe in the most, in some ways painful kind of point in my kind of while I was doing this research was this was in the Whitehall. I was in this kind of little meeting and I was talking about Chinese laborers, and that in Ypres in 1918, there's a lot of violence, including rape, being committed by kind of Chinese workers who themselves were subjected to a lot of kind of racism. And after I'd given the talk, this Chinese gentleman came up to me and said, "What do you gain out of it?" And that's a difficult moment. So I think what you are asking is basically the relationship between kind of an instrumental memory of the war and an ethical memory of the war. And I think I think we have to go, however painful it is, we have to go for the latter, for a more ethical memory of the war rather than a short-term instrumentality of that memory.
Thank you. That's yeah, I think that does answer my question to some degree. Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot.
I think Anwisha Kundu was next. Apologize if I've got the order wrong.
No, that's totally fine.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. And it got me thinking because so when we sort of talk about war and we talk about the formation of post-colonial nation states, the idea of how women figure in these times as sort of intense loci of gendered national imaginings, and how that sort of intersected with the glimpses you gave us of how women actually feature in these archives, of sort of the anti-war songs they sing, and this figure of a interracial international mother. It's very different from sort of Bharat Mata, right? So I was wondering sort of what is the messy presence, as I'm sure the presence is messy, of women in these archives? Like, are they present at all? Are they at the edges? I'd just be interested to hear you talk more about that.
Right. Thank you again. Another kind of brilliant question. And yes, messy, very, very messy. And I am kind of reminded of Jed Estes' talk kind of yesterday, the way he introduced class. And I think class is the single most important factor, I think, more than race, because, you know, the upper class elite kind of Indian princes, they were completely at par kind of with the British officers. So we have a lot of elite women and we have their voices and they're pro-war, pro-imperial. It's the poor rural women. So I think that, you know, gender without the class thing, it's not kind of always that meaningful. And yes, I think songs, that's one thing. The second thing, I have found some of their traces, because when their men, when kind of some of the men kind of died, they would write for compensation. And I've got almost a collection of kind of thumbprints of this kind of women, because they didn't know how to sign. So kind of they would put their kind of thumbprint there. And third, I've got some regional literature which represent these women. And that's why I think literature becomes very important, because as I said, it almost gives us a sensuous kind of inroad into their lives. But as Spivak once said, they're doubly in the shadow, this kind of poor, kind of working class kind of, or kind of rural women.
Thank you. That was the answer I was.
I mean, one other thing I've kind of also come across is that when the men were recruited, some of the women would trail them for miles, begging their men to come back home, and often picking these huge arguments with the recruiters. And one occasion, I remember, it's in the archives, they started picking up stones and throwing them at the British kind of recruiters. So you have some really feisty kind of women there.
Thank you. I don't think that strategy would be very out of fashion now, honestly. But
No.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think it might be Peter next.
Joe, I believe Shayoni has had her hand up for a while, so if she could go first.
Oh, okay. I'll hand over to you, Upasana. You can do it.
Oh, Shayoni. Oh, hi. How nice to see you. She's my cousin.
Hi.
Or rather my niece, not even my cousin, my niece. Wow, wow.
It's so good to see you. Things have come to such a pass that I have to stalk you at conferences. Thank you. It was such a lovely talk. And one thing that really struck me, you know, was when you were talking about the eroticization of the men and the Oriental gaze. So it made me think often of how these, in the archives, they remain as artifacts and commodities. But when you spoke of the palimpsestic nature of different archives, it seems like there is a move towards representation or an assertion of these millions of people who are perennially erased from, you know, Hollywood or British films' representation of these great war narratives that they churn out every summer. But I kind of felt rather pessimistic by the end when we talk about this cultural memory or the national narrative that again frames these people as part of that empire building militaristic tradition. So do you find that ultimately the representation gets co-opted or underwritten by the militaristic imperialist agenda?
You mean the representation of these men?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. There are two things happening there. I think a previous generation of scholars, especially South Asian historians, subaltern historians, firstly, they would absolutely refuse to work on these soldiers because they fought on the wrong side. I think kind of our generation at least has crossed that hurdle. Secondly, they often wouldn't touch anything that is kind of painted or photographed by the Europeans. Whereas I think that, you know, if an Indian aristocrat kind of photographs or paints an Indian, it is kind of at an equal remove as these European representations. I'm also a bit skeptical of the idea of Indians being just victims. You know, it's a very easy narrative. I think one has to work harder and try to recover agency, however circumscribed or however little, through processes of reading and piecing together of different bits of information. Like, for example, that, you know, in that film clip that I showed you, when that kind of hair kind of flies open, kind of those sparks of contingency, that's just one tiny example, they're throughout in the archive. So I think we have to work hard to recover kind of those kind of sparks and try to recover some degree of subjectivity of these men. I don't know whether I've managed to answer your
No, you
question.
did. And I think it's a nice way to kind of problematize the notion of counter narratives, because I feel a counter narrative always ultimately the primacy of the main or the hegemonic narrative stays the same. But when you talk about sparks of contingency, I think it forms perhaps a third way of imagining these presences of sort of emerging out of an absence or a space of commodification that is different. So yes, no, I think this is great.
Yes, commodification again also happens at different levels. Okay, and as I said, I was in a panel on Forster. Actually, I was talking about cruising in Forster, cruising in India, because in the King's College Cambridge archive, I've come across kind of quite a few kind of documents, and often I think, you know, we often slip too easily maybe into rhetoric about commodification. Just by the fact that they are kind of by kind of the European gaze. Often I think, I'll give you another example. The person who recorded the soldiers, I've gone kind of through his archive, it's in Berlin. And the degree of engagement that he has with these men, I think it exceeds just commodification of these men. For example, when the Indian sepoys were transferred from one POW camp to another, he gave up his job to be with the men and moved to another one. I'm not saying it's outside the colonial frame of reference, but I think there are kind of layers and layers through which we need to work through.
Thank you.
Peter?
Hi, great presentation. I learned a lot. It's amazing stuff that you're working with. And I wanted to piggyback on some of the questions that Jo was asking and prodding you with in her response to do with method. As you were presenting, I couldn't help thinking about some of the debates about surface reading, which have been so prominent in our discipline in literary studies over the last 10 years or so. And of course, I immediately thought of, you know, Rita Felsky's polemic in the limits of critique, where she's talking about not only that context stinks, but that ideology critique is deeply limiting and limited. And yet it seemed to me that you were taking a contrary position implicitly to that by suggesting that ambiguity is actually the essence of reading the archives and approaching this material, and that on and to propaganda, it's impossible not to do a certain amount of ideology critique. And so the question is really about what archival methods can bring to some of these discussions, which I don't think have accounted for the way that literary scholars who are interested in doing archival work, what they bring to the conversation. So it's really just an open invitation to think about what archival work adds.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you. Kind of difficult question. I think, firstly, I would say kind of reading the archive with an open mind, without a particular kind of argument at the back of your mind. Secondly, I think we have to kind of frame very careful frameworks. So for example, when I started working with photography, you have to really kind of learn the kind of grammar in order to do that, rather than just coming there as a literary scholar. Similarly, kind of when you move from, for example, photography to posters, again, there is a very different grammar. So I would say that there needs to be a lot of attention to the formal aesthetics of every single kind of medium within the archive. And then I guess, kind of to read kind of which object against which. And often also when things don't work together, I think that's one of the most important things, that when you have a certain hunch and you put three objects in conversation and they don't work, and it has often happened to me. And then I completely kind of, my whole kind of argument then had to change. So as I said that, I'm more like a magpie without any fixed kind of, I guess, apart from kind of close reading and also immersion, I guess, in the archive, like kind of months and months in order to get a feel of the material. Sorry, I don't think I have kind of addressed your question adequately, because as I said, that it's more of like a magpie attitude, meaning that kind of I have kind of picked up kind of over the years, because often I think kind of rigid, like I remember kind of Freud, from the gray of theory to the green of experience. So it's how you kind of recover kind of experience kind of from this kind of archival kind of fragments.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions. So I'll have it over to Christine, and then Zulfikar has typed in a question. So the two of you after each other.
Thank you. I was thinking about our reactions to your presentation. It's a lovely presentation, and it really was. But the aesthetics of presentation made me think about your question at the beginning about the archive. Is it a noun or is it a verb? Do we scholars create the archive, or do we take something out of it? And then you have this wonderful analogy, is it a train or is it a bolt cart where the wheels go off in different directions? And I wondered if you could comment on the difference between the archive we enter when we go into a room in a library versus the way archive has been used in a lot of contemporary scholarship as a book. Like the archive, we refer to different chapters construct an archive. A monograph is an archive, a book is an archive, a presentation is an archive.
Interesting, I hadn't thought about it, because yes, absolutely. And also kind of oral interviews as an archive, which kind of I'd kind of largely. So your question is, what is the difference between a book as an archive?
I'm also thinking about Tariq Jazil spoke on Monday about the physical experience of entering the Royal Geographical Society and having students in that space smell the polish on the banisters and see the portraits and see the faces of the white fathers of geography looking down at them, and then talking about how important it was to recognize that the people who managed the society invited them in for that experience, versus the way I've seen a lot of newer studies refer to the archive as a book. Or I was thinking about the archive we get on our screens today, right now, the archive you've shared, but it's a different, At any rate, it's an invitation.
Yes. No, absolutely. No, thank you. Because no, yes, on the first point, for example, and also the archive with the problems, because, you know, in my college, my room, it just directly faces what was the Codrington Library. So the Codrington Library as an archive. But I just said two things. In the last, I think, 5 years, the digital kind of turn had completely changed the nature of the archive. We often don't need to go to various places, and it has also changed our sensory relationship to the archive. So it's no longer that much touch or other things or smell, but it's largely visual. And I think that will have a huge impact on historical studies. Like between 2014 and 2018, I found far more material than I had for 10 years kind of before then. So I think that's a huge change. The second thing, I think for me, if I've understood your question correctly, a book as an archive and going to a physical archive, I think they are kind of very kind of different kinds of experience, I would say. And it's the experiential kind of dimension kind of I'm kind of very interested about, and also partly worried about, because we have a democratization of the archive with a digital turn. You know, anyone from, for example, in a village in India can upload something kind of precious and can also access other things. But on the other hand, I think we are also kind of in the danger of kind of losing something kind of precious in this kind of visual turn. And we are having almost too much material. It's almost an excess of documents we are bombarded with. That's a problem, I think.
Zulfikar?
Hi, Shantanu. It has always been a pleasure to read your work and a great pleasure to listen to you as always. And it's nice to see you. Shantanu, my question is about what you have mentioned that, I mean, while doing your research, you did expand the meaning of the archive, and you did meet families of all those, some of those soldiers. So my question is related to that when you met them after all those years, the way you critique the empire and the narratives which the empire had created to recruit all those soldiers, like the notion of martial races, the traditional concept of honor, and, you know, certainly this economic conditions, all these things. I mean, did you feel, or was there any were there any suggestions that the families of those people had rethought their notion, this notion as well? Were they were they able to look at the relationship between the empire and their ancestors differently after all these years? Or, like, I mean, if I could borrow a phrase from Jed Etsy, which he yesterday mentioned in his upcoming work, that, you know, certainly the hangover of the empire lasts longer, but so does, in my opinion, what the empire has fed to its subjects. So the notion of martial races was fed to those people, particularly in the Punjab. So what did people revise their relationship, or were the hangover was still there? This concept of honor, this concept of, you know, being from martial races and all these things. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
No, thanks. Again, it varies. I remember going to a recruitment village in Punjab where and they said that, you know, it's sad that kind of wars don't happen nowadays. We are martial races. That's all we do. So you have that. On the other hand, kind of I've interviewed a lot of people who had kind of said that, you know, this is kind of almost a site of trauma for us, that kind of my kind of grandfather kind of had to go and fight. So they had already revised it. They had revised it because I think the whole kind of revision happened not now, but after 1919, after Amritsar massacre. So Gandhi in 1918, he was recruiting Indian soldiers. In 1919, he turns his back on them and calls them hired assassins of the Raj. So 1919 is the point. So by the time, to go back to the question that Maud asked about the Second World War, that revision had already happened for numerous families. So I think the interwar is a very important kind of period.
All right. This seems like a good place to stop. Thank you so much to Santanu Dash.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks
Thank
everyone for your questions.
Thank you to Joe for moderating. Thank you to
Thank
everyone
you,
who
Joe.
attended and asked questions. I'll take just one brief moment to plug our Slack channel, where all of the keynote events and all of the panels have dedicated channels. And I believe there are some exciting channels about notable cameos from pets coming up. So it should be both fun and productive to carry on our conversation there. So yeah, feel free to move to that. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks again to everyone.
Thank you again, Upasana. Thanks.